We are back with Jacob today. And if there was ever any doubt that God can work through and in anyone, Jacob is it. If you were here a couple of Sundays ago, or if you weren't, or if you forgot, we left Jacob in the wilderness fleeing for his life against the wrathful and vengeful Esau, because he was guilty, Jacob was guilty of lying to his father, Isaac, having conspired and manipulated with his mother to cheat his brother Esau out of his birthright. But somehow, the swindler, the cheater Jacob is still the object of God's attention, God's affection, God's promise, and soon to be more blessings. Jacob's story occupies the 25th through the 35th chapters of Genesis, and he's important to our tradition because at the end of this story, he will have a new name, Israel. Jacob is as unlikely a religious patriarch as you can find anywhere. One might ask if our tradition couldn't have come up with a more nice character, someone a little less flawed than Jacob, but maybe, like his grandfather Abraham's flaws, Jacob's flaws are the point. 20 years earlier, after Jacob had his dream, he made his way across the border to meet his uncle Laban. He married Laban's daughters, plural, Leah and Rachel, had many children, and he became prosperous. His success is once again due to deception and fraud. At least he's consistent in that vein. In fact, Jacob has been systematically stealing from Laban his sheep right out from under him. It's really quite creative. And then when he has accumulated so much wealth that it's actually a little embarrassing to Jacob, he decides it's time to once again get out of Dodge and flee. He flees again during the night, and just for good measure, Rachel goes back into her father's home, the family home, and steals all the valuables. So much for finding family values in this part of the good book. As the story begins, Jacob and his family are out in the wilderness again, and they're at a stream. They're peering across into the land of Canaan, home. Jacob is returning to the place of his birth after all this time and bracing himself to reunite or to at least see Esau. Jacob has no idea how Esau will receive him, and he's afraid, and you can't really blame the man. And behind Jacob is an enormous caravan of livestock and all of his belongings, his wives, his concubines, and his children all wait. Jacob decides to divide this entourage into two parts in case Esau attacks, he then won't lose everything. He also sends elaborate and generous gifts over across the stream, thinking perhaps these gifts might somehow assuage and appease Esau. Or maybe his family can smooth things over with Esau before Jacob finally arrives. We do not know Jacob's thoughts. We only know that he sends everybody across the stream and decides to spend the night alone. And he sits down, as he did 20 years prior, in the dark, still a fugitive, still a fraud, still guilty and terrified, and he waits for dawn. The only sound in the background is the stream rushing, washing everything away. And then, a nameless, faceless stranger leaps out of nowhere and throws Jacob to the ground, and these two wrestle all night, we're told. But Jacob can't pin his opponent down, and literally, the goal of a wrestling match is to pin your opponent down. But all Jacob can do is to wrestle, to strive, to contend with, and to hold on for dear life. The hanging in and hanging on of our tenacious Jacob. This is scary, and this is holy stuff. In the middle of a dark night, the curtain is kind of drawn back, much like this artwork and a couple of the other pictures that I showed you. All pretenses have now faded away. Sight dims, reality shimmers, kind of like a mirage. You're sort of in between what has gone before and what will be. What's happening is clearly beyond anything that we can describe, even beyond our desires. What will be? What will it look like on the other side? Who will we become? Jacob's wrestler, who we only find out is God when Jacob is renamed Israel. By the way, Ishra means to strive. El means God, to strive with God. This God is wild and mysterious and unpredictable and strange. Jacob's God doesn't hesitate to muck around in the mud for several hours, trying to bring Jacob to his knees. Indeed, the Hebrew word for wrestle means to get dusty, to get dirty. This is no dainty God, no breakable God. This is a God of dust and sweat and blood and tears. A God who is willing to become dirty to lift us out of the dirt. Our God has an amazing way of intruding into our lives at our most basic human level, at our most vulnerable, often in surprising ways. Into Abraham and Sarah's settled life, the first patriarch. And then into Isaac and Rebekah's strained familial relationships, the second generation. And then even into Jacob's deception and his guilt and his terror, the third patriarch. God uses and blesses people not on the basis of goodness or moral purity, but on the basis that is something in the heart of God, which we call grace. God's blessing comes not as a reward for goodness, but in spite of Jacob's deceitfulness, his cheating, his manipulation, his life of dishonesty. Our God simply refuses to act the way we would prefer and instead startles us over and over and over again with love and with grace beyond all imagining. As dawn breaks, the stranger asks Jacob to disengage, and Jacob, relentless as ever, says, "No, I will not do that unless you bless me." Now wounded Jacob wants a blessing, but this time he isn't stealing the blessing. He's hung in long enough. He wants a blessing to go with his wound. It was somehow God who came to him in this place that he least wanted to be, in the physical intimacy of a wrestling match. His wound was a sign of his success. He hangs in and he hangs on. What matters is he hung on to God. He didn't let go. Sometimes winning, it is said, is nothing more sophisticated than not giving up. Sometimes our spiritual life is about little more than hanging on for dear life to a God who often seems mysterious to us and nameless and opaque, sometimes confusing, sometimes frightening. Sometimes the whole of our faith comes down to saying there's so much I can't wrap my head around here, but I know there's a blessing in this mess somewhere. I'm going to hang on until I find it. We can learn from Jacob's wrestling, but ultimately we can learn more from the blessing. A wise rabbi once said, "Jacob is our spiritual ancestor, most at home in the dark of night, and he offers us a map to follow in our own spiritual emergencies, in the middle of our own wrestling matches, when we don't know how things will turn out." As the story continues, the sun comes up and it becomes Jacob's turn to rename the place of his wounding and his blessing. And he calls this muddy wrestling place Peniel, the face of God. Once again, that El for Elohim. I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. It's important for us to remember and to name the places where God shows up and contends with us. These Peniels where God meets us in our darkness. These places where we lose and then find our own true names. These places where mystery wrestles us toward salvation. These places where we exhaust our own strength and collapse into the arms of God. These are the holiest of places, the places that leave us both blessed and limping all at once. The place of wrestling, the place where Jacob held on to God. We are right now trying to hang in and to hang on in the world. In these days of COVID, which have now stretched into months with no end in sight. In the words of Cameron Trimble, who writes in a blog called Piloting Faith, she writes, "Our world feels like it is falling apart. We don't know what to count on, who we can trust, what to believe. We don't know where to go or how to even be safe getting there. We don't know if our companies will survive or how our children will be affected by this trauma." She then quotes a portion of a poem written by Yeats called The Second Coming. I have read this poem to you before. He writes in a portion of it, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. The center is not holding, but when the center does not hold, let us hang in and hang on to God. The center which will, has, and always will hold on to us. I'd like to close with an old gospel spiritual, which I'm hoping will work. It's known by a few different names. Keep your hand on the plow, or keep your eyes on the prize, or hold on. It's been covered by numerous Black artists over the years, as well as the likes of Pete Seeger, Bruce Springsteen, and Bob Dylan. It was frequently sung at civil rights marches, and it became a sort of an anthem for them. And in the wake of the death of John Lewis, an early freedom rider, a civil rights activist, a congressman for more than 3 decades, and always a man of integrity, pushing for justice, practicing nonviolence, practicing forgiveness, a man of deep faith who knew what it meant to keep his hand on the plow. Listen now. And you can like, you can groove to this. That's always going to give me? Okay.
Yeah.
That's always going to give me, okay.
I should have taken it in.
Keep your hand on the plow, hold on when my way gets dark at night. I know the Lord will be my light. Keep your hand on the plow, hold on. Hang in and hang on. Keep your hand on the plow that is Christ, our Emmanuel, God with us. Your future, my future, our future together rests in God, the center, which will always hold. Thanks be